Ask an Expert Firewise virtual workshop series, Get to Know the Home Ignition Zone. This is the third year for the series, with one session scheduled each month through November, and we hope you'll join us for the remainder of the season. Registration for the September session will be open this afternoon. I'm Kathy Prudhomme, the Firewise Program Manager with the National Fire Protection Association's Wildland Fire Division, located in our Denver field office, and your host for today's one-hour workshop. Joining me in Denver is Aaron Anderson, our tech expert who's keeping us live and connected. This session received close to 190 registrations from 34 states and 3 countries, so our thanks to each of you from around the world that are joining us today. It's being recorded and will be available in our archive at the end of the session, so please share it with your stakeholders, your colleagues, and neighbors. It can be found at firewise.org under the Online Courses and Education tab. If you're not familiar with the Firewise Communities USA program, I encourage you after the workshop to visit firewise.org to learn more about how you can get involved where you live. There's currently 1,320 active Firewise communities in 40 states. Each has met a rigorous set of criteria to become part of the national program, where residents in wildfire-prone areas work to reduce their risk annually while increasing their potential for survivability at both the individual parcel level and throughout their neighborhood and larger community. In today's session, we'll be covering the specific areas within the 3 home ignition zones and how each is different. But before we get started, just a quick overview of the format and an introduction of our guest, Ask an Expert presenter Gary Marshall. For approximately the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk to Gary about the home ignition zones and why they're important. Then we'll take the balance of the hour as an opportunity for him to answer your questions. At any time from now until we get to that interactive component, if you have a question for Gary, you can submit it in the lower right-hand side of the video window using that Ask a New Question feature, and we'll get him to respond to as many of those as time permits. Now, without further delay, it's my privilege to introduce you to Gary Marshall. His firefighting career began in 1977. 35 years later, in 2012, he retired as the Deputy Fire Chief and Fire Marshal with the City of Bend, Oregon. He's worked as a contractor for NFPA for many years, as a home ignition zone workshop instructor, and also as a regional wildland fire advisor. He's very active in the state of Oregon where he lives and where he's involved with fire prevention committees and organizations on both the local and state levels. He's currently the Community Risk and Fire Safety Manager for the Sisters Camp Sherman Fire District. Gary's one of those people that you love to visit with. One of my favorite stories that he tells is in his rafting guide life, he once had Will Ferrell on one of his multi-day trips, and he's always full of good stories. I've known him for about 4.5 years, and he's one of the most knowledgeable and experienced individuals on this topic. So welcome to you, Gary, and thanks for being our Ask an Expert today.
Thank you, and I'm very, very glad to be here today, Kathy.
Well, let's start off with you giving us a description of where the 72,000 communities at risk from a wildfire are located throughout the U.S.
Well, Kathy, maps are often misinforming to the public, as well as agency personnel, about where the wildfire problem exists. There's maps that demonstrate where the high fire potential exists, and there are maps that demonstrate where structures were lost from a wildfire event. These maps are valuable for creating statistical information as well as giving analytical evaluation of specific geographical boundaries, but as we know, a boundary line does not necessarily stop a wildfire. We also know from validated fire science that it's a set of conditions that will dictate whether or not a structure will burn. If the structure is vulnerable to wildfire and not properly mitigated so it can ignite, and sometimes it can actually ignite easier than the grass, brush, and trees that surround it. Embers are the most common reason for home loss in wildfire. The home or the structure can be a far, far distance from the wildfire, and structures will ignite from embers that travel ahead of that wildfire. So it's all about how vulnerable the structure is to a surface fire or the embers that fly through the air. If the structure meets the requirements for combustion, it will burn. With that said, even though the zones are effective to decrease the risk of wildfire to the home, it is equally important, and in some cases more important, that we look at the home construction components that make up, and as far as how fire resistant the home actually is.
Well, Gary, there's several commonly used terms to describe the area around homes in wildfire-prone areas. You know, there's defensible space, there's safety zone, there's structure ignition zone, and then the home ignition zone. Tell us if those terms are interchangeable, and if not, how are they different?
Yeah, Kathy, you know, the fire service is well known for their acronyms and creating terms for training and education purposes. The zone terms are just another one of those adverbs that demonstrate an area or where the area is located. Now, Dr. Jack Cohen, which recently was a research physical science with the Forest Service in Missoula, Montana, created the Structure Ignition Assessment Model, SIAM, which incorporates zones into one model which is intended for the facilitation of improved fire safety, as well as to identify potential wildland-urban interface fire problems for single home assessments or planned developments. Defensible space was one of the earliest terms in my fire career to demonstrate a zone around a home or structure where vegetation should be treated or mitigated to slow or stop the fire before reaching the structure. Now, some have challenged that term because it sounds like the home is defendable or had to be defended by firefighters for the structure to actually survive. The term is still often used and interchanged with the zones, but does not necessarily define the home needs the firefighters there, that firefighters actually need to be there to defend it. Worst case scenario, there won't be anyone there to defend those homes in a wildfire. So we need to evaluate the surrounding vegetation with zone mitigation practices to limit fire spread to the home with an assumption that there may not be anyone responding.
Well, Gary, is home ignition zone the terminology of choice for you? You know, both you and I travel a lot, and when we go to fire departments or we meet with forestry agencies, I definitely hear that term interchangeable. What do you choose to use when you're talking about the zones?
Well, again, because I teach the home ignition zone classes, the home ignition zone is what I use. It actually describes to the homeowner that their structure has defined ignition zones. That helps them to recognize that there are steps they can take in each zone to reduce their risk from wildfire. Now, once you explain that, in a high-density neighborhood, you could have other property owners within your home ignition zone where you have no control over their property. It becomes a great segue to talk about the value of Firewise Communities USA program.
Well, home ignition zone is definitely a mouthful. Is there an acronym we can use to describe the area that you're going to tell us about?
Yes. We couldn't pass on an opportunity to create yet another acronym within the fire service. So we often relate to home ignition zone as the HIZ. But you know, Kathy, when speaking with homeowners, it's best to use the home ignition zone, or zones 1, 2, and 3, rather than the acronym HIZ. Communicating without fire service jargon and speaking to the homeowner in terms that help them understand is a key factor for them to start their mitigation work.
Okay, now tell us how many zones are in the HIZ, because we've had questions where some people are a little bit confused. Is there 3? Is there 4? And what are those distances? Because there seems to have been some recent changes in that.
Well, originally there were 3 zones, and there still is. I mean, 0 to 30 feet, 30 to 100 feet, and 100 to 200 feet. But recently, due to new fire science, an immediate zone was added, and that's the 0 to 5 feet area that's directly adjacent to the structure now. So the zones have changed due to this immediate zone, but there's still just 3 zones. I need to make that clear. The 0 to 5 feet and 5 to 30 feet are the most critical. So now 0 to 5 feet is zone 1, with 5 to 30 feet being zone 2, and then 30 to 100 feet is zone 3. Now we often talk about the next 100 to 200 foot area from the structure, which that can be incorporated into zone 3 when a resident's property actually extends that far out from the home.
Well, Gary, tell us why it's important to have those 3 unique zones. You know, is the mitigation work different in each zone? Give us some more information on that.
Well, Kathy, the ignition zone primarily determines the ignition potential of the home from an approaching surface fire, or from radiant heat, or convected heat from burning trees, or those larger fuel types. This zone includes the home and its immediate surroundings up to 100 to 200 feet. Now, under most conditions, 100 feet or less around homes and accessory structures may be enough distance to treat, while intense fires and heavier fuels on sloped terrain may require mitigation extended to a distance of 200 feet from the structure. Now, through laboratory modeling, field experiments, and post-fire assessments, it's been shown that manipulating landscaping and vegetative fuels in the home ignition zone gives the structure a better chance of surviving an approaching wildfire. If everyone in a community mitigates the fuels on their property, we know that communities actually become fuel breaks that can better withstand high-intensity fires. You know, it's rare to have 100% participation in mitigation activities across neighborhoods or communities, but the more people that participate, the more they're improving their overall chances of survival. It's all interconnected, and residents have to understand that what they do and what they don't do impacts more than just their own property.
Gary, you said the home ignition zone has 3 parts. Let's start with zone 1. Can you walk us through that area and describe what it should look like and why it should look like that?
Well, first of all, when talking about structures, we need to consider all attachments to that structure. That includes a combustible deck, a wood fence, and garage or the carport. We say if it's attached to the house, it's considered part of the house. And that's where we start the 0 to 5 foot zone, from the furthest attachment to the house. Now, Dr. Cohen's research found that most spruce and pine trees burn out of their high-intensity heat within about 60 seconds. Now, that's just 60 seconds. If I stop talking for 60 seconds, that would illustrate how short of a time period that actually is. Therefore, the intense heat does not last long enough to sustain the burning of wood wall just 30 feet away. And if there's no combustible fuels against the wood siding, then we've created an opportunity for survivability of that home. So it's the big flames and high heat. We need to stay out of zones 1, zones 2, and when possible, out of zone 3 also. By focusing first on the area closest to the home, which is the immediate area around the structure, that's the 0 to 5 feet, now called zone 1. Now, remember, this area is critical. The goal is to have no flaming combustion occur within zone 1. This 5-foot area directly adjacent to the furthest edge of the structure requires diligent fuel management to prevent a fire from propagating from vegetation to landscaping materials or other combustibles such as a pile of split firewood. This zone is new to the process and a direct result of fire experience and recent research. Now, I tell homeowners that my recommendation is to have this 5-foot area be completely non-combustible, but at the very least it should be fire resistant. It doesn't have to be ugly, and hardscaping can be pretty attractive. Plants in this area should be small in size. They need to be well watered and trimmed. Also, they could be one of the selected fire-resistant plants for your region. Now, most state forestry and extension offices have lists of these types of plants. Now, the surface area should be dirt, rock, gravel, or some other type of non-combustible material. Don't put combustible mulch in this area. Dry grass, tree litter, combustible plants, bark mulch, or even pine straw will allow heat transfer from these fuels, if ignited, to a nearby combustible wall, a deck, a fence, or even create embers that can enter an exterior vent. The goal is that this area should not propagate fire spread to the home, which could be from a surface fire or embers collecting within plants or mulch materials.
You know, Gary, when we're out talking in communities, people always want to know, where do I start? You know, it's pretty overwhelming. You've given me a lot of information. I just don't even know where to begin. Is Zone 1 the area that you recommend folks start working in first?
Well, looking within the home ignition zone outside of the structure, it definitely is the place to start. Fire science demonstrates that fuel treatments in Zone 1 can be very effective. Often we need to start out with something the homeowner can do effectively in a short amount of time to provide them with the feeling that mitigation is achievable, an activity that they can do with a very minimal cost. Besides having debris-free roofs that are made of Class A roofing materials, Zones 1 and Zones 2 are areas where effective fuel treatments can make the biggest impact for increasing the chances of home surviving and approaching wildfire.
Well, that was a lot of things to consider in Zone 1. How often, or have you ever, seen a property where everything you just recommended has actually been completed? Does that exist?
It does, Kathy. It really depends where we're talking about throughout the U.S. You know, I've traveled across the U.S. teaching HIZ classes and have visited many communities. The areas where there's been recent wildfires and where local fire and forestry agencies are promoting wildfire home safety, you know, they're doing a lot of education and outreach, and they're supporting chipping days and similar events. This is where I've seen a lot of changes in the last 5 years. There's a lot more happening now compared to the last decade or two, I can tell you that. You know, it's difficult for homeowners to get motivated when they don't perceive a threat from wildfire. But there's a lot of resources out there to see if the home is in a wildfire-prone area. The fact is, and supported by those studying social behavior, it sometimes takes a wildfire to motivate residents to mitigate. And that's really sad, that with today's technology, folks are not acting on the potential of a fire to happen. Now, those who live in areas that are what I often call the asbestos forests, where the fire occurrence intervals may be, say, every 30 to 50 years, people become complacent. And I often hear from them, well, you know, this will never happen to me, or I have insurance and everything will be replaced if I have a fire. But that certainly is not reality, or the mindset people should have. Due to national wildfire education programs such as Firewise and Fire Adapted Communities and IFC's Ready, Set, Go program, property owners are becoming engaged and taking actions to minimize the threat of losing their home. Residents have to embrace mitigation. They can't be complacent. It has to become part of living in a place where wildfires can happen. I always tell people to do the research before they buy a home. Find out what the wildfire risk is before you buy. Talk with the local fire department and forestry agencies. You have to become informed.
You know, it's funny, this is a long time ago, but in one of my visits with a community member, one of the things they said was, well, my real estate agent never told me there was a wildfire risk. And it was one of those where you never want to chuckle at somebody's response, but I thought of all the people to consult about your wildfire risk, and they really considered their real estate agent to be the professional. Tell me, have you seen a home that was not lost in a fire and the mitigation work that the residents did was credited for it surviving?
Yes, indeed. I'm seeing more and more testimonials each year of home survival, due to the work that homeowners are doing before the fire. Of course, it's much easier now to document these homes with cell phone cameras, which I do encourage firefighters to take, because that documentation is powerful in demonstrating the importance of mitigation. So often, we only see footage or photos of homes destroyed by fires. That makes for good primetime television, right? But we need more home survival photos to show that the science does work. It's often inexpensive activities that save homes. Getting the work done is not rocket science. As firefighters, we need to direct the media when out on the fire ground towards the actions that residents did well. It's really important to start showing that homes can survive wildfires. It's powerful to show, what can be a positive outcome. We have to stop focusing on just the homes that were destroyed. When I see photos of a home that wasn't lost, there's typically evidence that the property owner took steps to reduce the amount of combustible vegetation around the home as part of their effort to lessen a fire's intensity. And that work comes with an added bonus, because it gives firefighters a better chance to extinguish the fire before it can impact the structure and really become a disaster for that community.
That last picture that you used, Gary, tells just volumes of stories. So you have homes that look like not even the vegetation was scorched, and then across the street there's homes that were lost. So exactly what you described. It's one of those pictures that just tells so much about the value and the power of mitigation. Well, let's move on to Zone 2. Can you tell us about that area?
Well, Kathy, the goal of Zone 2, that 5 to 30 foot area, is to get the wildfire to slow down and decrease the fire's intensity before it reaches the home. Within Zone 2, we want the fire to stay out of the trees, and when it's there, we want it to stay on the ground and slow it to the point that it doesn't have fuel when it reaches Zone 1. Even when the fire's on the ground and out of the tree canopies within Zone 2, the structure is still vulnerable to spot fires from airborne embers. Mitigation requires annual maintenance. It's not a one-time activity. And again, as I said before, we need to continue to harden, or as some call it, fortify the home to resist ember ignitions. The vegetation within Zone 2 should be spaced, so a wildfire will not burn from plant to plant. Medium-sized plants, medium-sized bushes, and shrubbery can exist in this area, and it should be maintained at all times. So flame heights are less than 3 feet, so they don't burn with high amounts of impact to the home or other bushes. I prefer this area to have a watered green lawn with islands of shrubs with the continuity of fields broken up by grass or different types of hardscaping. We can have a small fire creeping in Zone 2, but we want it to be very, very low intensity. Remember, if these plants or these trees are combustibles within within the 30-foot zone do not ignite. They're now heat sources which will increase the risk to the home by radiant, convected, or conducted heat. Now, firewood piles should not be within this zone. Okay, trees can be within this zone, but at a lower density than in zone 3. I recommend 20-foot spacing between the tree crowns, which will reduce the risk of tree-to-tree ignition. This kind of spacing also provides better overall tree health, which makes them better and able to withstand a fire. Tree limbs should be pruned up from the ground, and I recommend not more than, say, 25% of the tree's lower canopy be removed, especially on small trees, unless it's approved by an expert on plant health care. You know, I suggest homeowners create a 6-foot clearance under a mature tree when it's on relatively flat surface, so prune up about 6 feet. It's easy to mow under and easy to take care of. Now, if trees are on a slope or if there is combustible vegetation under the tree canopy, of course, more clearance is going to be needed because of that flame height. Often I find where, you know, there are neighbors in close proximity to each other. They want to keep the vegetation for screening and privacy reasons, but the risk will be greater for these trees and shrubs to burn unless diligent management of the surface fuels under these trees is exercised on a regular interval.
Gary, before we start taking some of the live questions from today's participants, can you take us into Zone 3 and explain to us what should be happening in that area too?
Yeah, Kathy, you know, Zone 3 is the area from 30 to 100 feet away from structures. And in some areas where you own that much property, it may extend up to 200 feet, as I said before. Many of us don't have that much privately owned property. But for residents that do or might have control over, say, common areas that are within this 30 to 100-foot zone, they should take a look at this area and not neglect it, that it is part of the overall big picture. Now, it's even more important if a sloped hill is leading up to structures or under those combustible decks. Remember, the intent is to keep the high-intensity flames at least 100 feet from the home itself. Field experiments conducted by Dr. Cohen and his colleagues in the Northwest Territories concluded that it took a distance of over 100 feet for radiant heat from burning canopies over 10 minutes to ignite a wood wall. Zone 3 could also have a south-facing aspect of the hill where the vegetation dries out faster in the morning, which would become ripe for an afternoon fire. Now, aspect is the direction of which the slope faces, which plays a role in how quickly the fuels can ignite because they dry out faster. You know, I tell residents that Zone 3 should resemble what the forest looked like, say, 80 to 100 years ago before fire management policies. Take a look at pictures from that time period and you'll see what we have now is not what healthy forest should look like. It should be an area that supports good forest health, where the trees are receiving ample sunlight and water with space in between the trees to resist bugs and insects that can kill the trees. A healthy, managed forest can be a fire-resilient landscape that should resemble forests of yesteryear.
Well, I know one of the things that confuses people too, Gary, is, okay, I've been working diligently on my property, but my neighbor's not doing anything. So talk to us about property lines and what happens if a resident doesn't own the full distance into zones 2 or 3.
Well, as I mentioned, there's often times that multiple structures can exist within the distance of a single home ignition zone. Relationships between property owners need to be nurtured. To create awareness and education on the effects of wildfire and the steps that can be taken towards reducing risk from wildfire, Working with neighbors to accomplish mitigation can't be stressed enough, Kathy. It's key to creating a fire-resistant landscape. Programs like Firewise Communities moves beyond the site-specific single home to the broader community level and how it all impacts each other. If one or maybe two homes are burning, firefighters are typically able to do a pretty good job of keeping the fire from becoming a disaster. But once several homes are burning, often what we call structure-to-structure ignitions, the size of the fire can quickly exhaust our firefighting resources, and we become ineffective as a fire suppression provider. It's what neighbors do or don't do within the home ignition zone that can directly affect the outcome of whether homes will burn or not. The Firewise Communities program empowers residents to follow Firewise principles, thus, reducing the risk of wildfire to their neighborhood. It provides a social and mechanical framework to become a residential area focused on survivability. I highly encourage homeowners, along with fire safety forestry agencies, to visit Firewise site at firewise.org and get involved long before there's smoke in the air. Participating in this program requires an annual commitment from residents and recognizes their efforts.
Gary, in that same vein, what should a homeowner's plan of action be if their property crosses over into, say, I don't know, county parkland, state or national forest land? What should that plan of action be for them?
Well, this is not a new quote, but I say all hands, all lands. All property owners and all land managers need to be working towards the same goal. Whether a fire starts on county, state, or federal lands, or even if the fire starts in a private planned community development, fire doesn't recognize property lines, as we said before, so it's important for all property owners to work together. Now, with that said, we can only conduct fuel reduction mitigation on properties where we have authority. As a homeowner, I normally do not have authority to go on someone else's land and cut brush and trees. Besides, if you trespass and start a fire from some type of mechanical thinning, you will be responsible for that fire. Also, we need to remember there can be local tree ordinances, defined riparian areas, or fish habitat areas along waterways, as well as other specific designations that are in place to take care of other forest and agency interests. This is where Community Wildfire Protection Plans, CWPP, can be effective. It brings those government landowners together with private property owners to develop a relationship and start the planning process to create fuel mitigation practices through mechanical and prescribed fire treatments. Now, even though the big fires and the big flames may start in forested areas, we need to remember that the most critical areas that can be controlled are in zones 1 and 2. This is where the homeowner usually has the responsibility and can truly make an impact on their home's potential for survivability. Statistics reinforce this by demonstrating you have a better chance of surviving a wildfire without firefighter intervention. If you focused on zones 1 and 2, and along with a fire-resistive roof that's maintained and clear of debris, and cleaning the gutters so they're free of litter, in the big picture, little actions play a big role in helping a home survive a fire. We maintain our cars to keep them running. We go to the dentist and to the gym to maintain our health. Yet maintenance to save our largest financial investment and perhaps even our lives, or the lives of firefighters, is not something that everyone prioritizes. Wildfire mitigation is doable and it's achievable.
Gary, thanks. That was so much information. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions and people looking for more information. We finished a few minutes early on that, which is a good thing because that gives us time to ask more questions. I'm going to go to, we already have a few questions that have been posted, so I'm going to jump to the first one. And the first one is from Paulette, and Paulette says, in Zone 2, what height do you suggest for trimming on a steep grade?
Well, it really depends on the slope, and we definitely have to look through a different set of glasses on the slope. So we want to make sure that if we have surface fuels that will allow flame impingement to those lower hanging tree limbs, that they need to be pruned up higher. If we remove the surface fuels, then we can actually keep those lower hanging limbs, closer to the ground. But I would recommend 6 to 8 feet if the tree is mature enough to allow that much mitigation of trimming the lower hanging limbs. It gives you ample area around the tree canopy to get in there with a weed eater and cut the grass and remove those other surface fuels underneath the canopy so that fire will not propagate into the canopies, therefore throwing embers on top of the structure and other accessory structures in the home ignition zone.
Good info, Gary. Our next question is from Tom, and Tom wants to know, what comments would you make regarding, I'm sorry, I just lost Tom's question. Hold on. What comment would you make regarding the impact of dead trees that are left standing among live trees in zones 2 or 3?
Well, dead trees, there's other interests involved in them, such as they can be considered wildlife habitat trees, and so often we want to leave those. It is best to create a defensible space around those trees so fire will not propagate into the tree itself, especially if it has a lot of open cracks and rotted out areas. Fire could get into those areas and involve that tree. But usually when I look at dead trees, the foliage is gone. But there are some dead trees that still have dead foliage on them. Now, that can be very combustible. So, therefore, I would take care of that issue by either falling the tree, especially if it's an insect tree where those insects could be transferred to other live trees. You may want to remove that tree. And if you're not sure, bring a professional out that can advise you on that tree whether or not you need to remove it. And also be sure that you own that property. Often I find people that want to remove trees for line of sight to the mountains or a stream, what have you, and not necessarily are they in the best interest of wildfire mitigation, but they're just trying to get a better view. So again, you might bring somebody out that's a professional, take a look at that for you and help you make the decision whether or not to remove that dead tree. But there are other agencies that would like to see a lot of those dead trees stay because there's squirrels, there's woodpeckers, and other types of wildlife that use those trees. So we need to be conscious of those efforts also.
We have another question from Paulette, and she wants to know, what distance do you recommend between stems in Zone 3 if you're on a moderately steep grade?
Well, again, I don't know what moderate would be. In some eyes, moderate might be 40%. I consider low anything up to 20% grade. That's my personal feeling, but I've seen other literature that actually goes to 40% grade as low to moderate. And again, in those areas, if the surface fuels have been removed either by mechanical treatments or by some other type of thinning procedures, then you can leave the limbs a little bit lower to the ground. In those areas, I would still be looking at the 5 to 6 foot clearance, most likely. I've seen some prescriptions where they are actually asking for 8 feet of clearance between the lower hanging limbs and the surface. I believe the prescription in those areas could be modified to where you have some trees that have lower hanging limbs, maybe down into the 4 or 5 foot area, and then maybe have some others that are 8 feet, so it looks more like a natural forest.
Gary, our next question is from Joe, and I apologize because it looks like Joe maybe exceeded his characters here. I'm going to read the question and then we'll ask Joe if he can provide us with the rest of his question. So he says he has a comment. He's taken the HIZ course twice at past Backyards and Beyond conferences. I don't know if you were his instructor or not, Gary.
Probably Pat Nerlin.
He said he finds the introduction of Firewise Principles DVD on the Firewise website, and then he got cut off. So Joe, if you want to expound a little bit more on what your comment is, that's great. Maybe you're just telling us that that DVD worked really well for you, which I guess is an opportunity for me to plug that you can get that video for free. You can order it on a DVD or it can be downloaded. And to get the DVD and get it shipped to you for free, just go to firewise.org and hit the catalog tab, and you can go into that catalog, and almost everything in the catalog is free, and the shipping to send that to you is also free. It looks like we don't have any more questions, but Gary, actually, I have some questions for you, and they pertain to your state and the work that you're doing in Oregon. Can you tell us some of the new things that are going on in Oregon? And I know we've had some conversations about communities that are really energized and are doing much more mitigation than they have in the past, and maybe share with us some of those stories.
Yeah, Oregon's really become one of the leaders now in the nation for Firewise communities. When I was the Firewise advisor a few years back, Oregon only had 20 to 30 Firewise communities, and over the last 3 years, they're up to over 100 Firewise communities now. In fact, we just had our 100th Firewise community here outside of Sisters, Oregon, and we had the State Forester Doug Decker attend, as well as U.S. Forest Service, and a lot of the community members. I think we had close to 50 people in attendance. And it was great to hear the stories, the impact of wildfires to the different communities and throughout the state, and what Firewise and Firewise principles are working. One of the newer programs that we're starting to pilot here in our region is called the 4-Star program. It's a way to recognize those Firewise communities that are and how much work they're actually doing on their property. For a long time now, and we've heard at conferences like Backyards and Beyond, that there's no way to measure how effective or how much mitigation has been done within a Firewise community for maybe fire suppression forces. They may, as far as a firefighter, they may need to know how defendable that community is. So once we came back from the Backyards and Beyond conference, a group of us got together with actually a focus group from Firewise communities and from several Firewise communities, and we wanted to hear from them on how we could rate that Firewise community and to give firefighters the information that they need, and also a way to empower Firewise communities to continue to work on their Firewise community plan, to empower them to do more work. So we came up with this 4-Star program, and we said 4-Star, like 4-Star restaurant or 4-Star general. So, in our culture, that means a lot to us. And so we have actually rated some communities through a process to find out how defendable they are. And if we find that they are, say, 0 to 25% defendable, they get 1 gold star. 25 to 50%, they get 2 gold stars. 50 to 75%, they get 3 gold stars, and if they are over 75% defendable, they get 4 gold stars. And this is put on a companion sign that is mounted to their Firewise sign. And again, as I said before, it's a pilot program. We've done 3 communities so far in the Central Oregon region. And what we hope to do is to get more of these done and actually present this at the Backyards and Beyond Conference in Boise in 2017. We're doing, you know, again, as other states, Oregon is they're doing things after the fire often. It takes that burning ember to get the interest, but there are places in southern Oregon, Ashland, Oregon. What's so different about them is that I believe the majority of their Firewise communities are within the city limits, where often what I find with my region, most of the Firewise communities, if not all, are outside the city limits in more rural or suburban areas. So people are becoming more empowered both within the city limits and out in the rural areas. And you know, again, we're very proud of what's going on here in Oregon, but as I said before, throughout the nation we have 40 states now that have Firewise communities, and over 1,300 Firewise communities in those states. So I'm very proud of that, and the amount of work that they are doing saves, you know, firefighters, you know, that time and energy when they show up on the fire line, so they're not, you know, cleaning up the property and removing wood piles themselves. They can focus on, you know, the low intensity fire and get the flames put out before they reach the structures.
Thanks, Gary. That was some good info. We have a couple more questions. This one's from Karen. And Karen says, if they're working in that 0 to 5 foot zone, other than the roof being A-rated, what are other priorities to change out in the home material? Is there a certification that they should be looking for?
I don't know of any certification, and I advise that you go on the firewise.org website and watch Steve Quarles' program that was taped, because it goes into a lot of that information as far as siding, roofing material, and the components of the structure. But again, we want that fire to be out, if at all possible, within that 0 to 5 foot area. If we have bark mulch or pine straw in that area and embers ignite that, with a windy environment, you are going to have some flame heights of 4, 5, 6 inches, maybe even higher, depending on the depth of that material. So if you have wood siding that is touching that pine straw or wood mulch, or if there are combustible bushes within that 0 to 5 foot area that combust, there's a very good chance that your siding is going to combust and then go up underneath the eaves, which is more or less a heat trap, and transfer those sparks or embers into the attic area through the vents. So this is a critical area, and it's a new area that we're really focusing on, because through fire science and through past fire investigations, we're showing that small distances that we treat can really help the home survival.
Gary, our next question is from Terry. And Terry says, both of us could probably tag team this one with a bunch of answers. Within our Firewise community, we have those who resist our program to create defensible space around their homes and along our private road access. Has there been methods recommended in educating such people to take action? So how can we get them on the bus?
Wow. Again, when I was the Firewise advisor, often we found people that had a recent fire. That's how you got them on the bus, while that ember was still hot and there's still maybe even smoke in the air. It motivates residents to take part in programs like Firewise and fire adapted communities and Ready, Set, Go. It's when that ember starts to get cold, people start to lose interest. And in some of the other cities, I had a person tell me it's like training a new first grade class every year because there's such a transient population of new people coming in. But it really takes agencies and people that are listening to this program to take action, whether you be in the insurance industry, whether you be in a fire agency or some other type of agency that promotes prevention. You need to take action and get these people involved. I've had residents up in northwest Washington that, as I said before, we call the asbestos forest because their fire intervals are so far apart. And they've actually got a lot of Firewise communities started. In fact, they had more in that area of the state of Washington at that time than eastern Washington did, and that's where they have the fires. And the reason was because they had a spark plug in the fire service that started these communities and got the people involved. Even though there's a lot of rain, probably over 30 to 40 inches of moisture a year, people got involved because they were trying to be prepared not only for wildfire, but it brought a sense of community together, and it actually led to other things. It led to, you know, things as far as intrusion and people working with law enforcement and knowing what other people needed assistance. And it might have been somebody of elderly age that where they don't have family close by, so the community members were helping them out. So it's sometimes it doesn't really have to be about the fire, that it's all about being the community again. And maybe Kathy, you can maybe jump in on this one too.
Sure, and I think it's every community is so unique in what's going to be the hot button for those people that are maybe resisting participation. I can tell you there's communities that those champions and those residents who truly want to embrace the concepts and reduce their risk, that oftentimes just their energy and their persistence is going to rub off on the others. You know, one story in particular I can tell you is I had this neighborhood champion who forever would tell me stories about the guy across the street won't do anything. He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to hear about it. He doesn't want to participate. And one day my phone rings and it's him, and he goes, "You're never going to believe this. He's out there with chainsaws and he's been working for days." And he goes, "I went over and I talked to him and I said, 'So you're finally interested in doing some wildfire mitigation?' And the guy said, 'No. My wife likes the way everybody else's properties look, and now she's making us do ours too.'" So it's that side benefit that I cannot tell you the hundreds of people that make comments that we didn't want to do mitigation because we bought here because we like the way it looks, we like the aesthetics, we like the thick trees, and once they started doing mitigation, they really liked how it opened up their view. More wildlife came in, the trees were truly healthier. So I think that sometimes everybody takes a little bit different length of time to get on board and to start participating, and if something doesn't work, try something else. For some people it's not reducing the risk around their property, but maybe it's evacuation, maybe it's homeowners insurance, anything that's going to really get them started on doing the whole package of working around their property. So Terry, you're more than welcome to give me a call. I'm going to give you my desk line here and we can brainstorm some ideas. My number here is 303-736-8461. And I want to get back to Joe's question. Joe had talked about taking the HIZ course, and he was looking for some materials that could help him with that. And Michelle Steinberg in our division gave him a link where he can go and get some of that information that's really in the instructor guide for that course, and it's on firewise.org. And Joe, let me give you my number again if you need more information on that. It's 303-736-8461, and I can give you that information and that link that will help you get that information and the materials that you're looking for. It looks like we don't have any more questions at this point. We had a couple minutes left. I want to take a moment and promote the next virtual workshop. It's on Thursday, September 15th. The time is a little bit different. That next one is going to be at noon Mountain Daylight Time. And it's understanding homeowners insurance in the wildland urban interface. And our Ask an Expert is going to be Carol Walker. Carol is the executive director with the Rocky Mountain Insurance Information Association. And as you know, Gary, we always get a lot of questions about insurance and how that works and what it covers and what it doesn't cover and what insurance companies know and what they don't know. And it's always an eye-opening opportunity to get a refresher on that information and listen to people's questions. I think it's very informative and a great opportunity for people to ask those types of questions. Carol works for the Rocky Mountain Insurance Information Association and has a broad knowledge about all of those areas of the questions that people are going to ask. And then in October, we have some great community risk reduction success stories. It's funny, when we planned for the season back in early first quarter of this year, we lined up some success stories, and we have had so many great successes from this fire season of communities that had saves because the homeowners had done mitigation, that we're inviting those folks to come and talk about their recent successes, that they were able to save their homes or have their homes saved through the work that they did. So those success stories will be on October 11th, and on November 9th, we have Wildland Fire Urban Legends, which is also a good one. It's really part 2. Last year we had so much interest in that. We do have one more question, and this is from Denise. And Denise is asking, I want to ask, what is the risk of having a propane tank within Zone 1, and what should be done to protect the home from an explosion from that propane tank?
Well, within Zone 1, that's that 0 to 5 foot area, NFPA Standard 58, as well as a lot of other codes I see, the maximum size tank you can have in that area is 125 gallons. So that is allowed within the Zone 1. Now, within Zone 2, you might see another literature floating around the internet that propane tanks should not be in that area. And what we're finding through fire science and through past fire investigations, that these tanks, the way they're built today, they will not levy, or they won't explode. Very seldom do we ever see that with today's tanks. What we do need to know is that these tanks, you need to keep a good clean area around them so there's no fire propagating to underneath the tank. Because underneath the tank you could have the gas line, which is made out of polypropylene or maybe some other type of flammable line that could actually melt. And if it melts, then we have an issue. And the tank may not explode, but it's going to spread fire. So again, these tanks need to be identifiable, meaning that firefighters need to be able to see the tanks so they recognize there is a potential issue there. And you need to keep a good 10-foot clearance of green watered grass around it or gravel, so you don't have any type of fire impingement against that tank. But I would not be worried about the tanks exploding unless, again, if they're in Zone 0 to 5 feet, if the house is burning, there is that possibility. But usually if the home is burning, the home's been evacuated, and the only people in the area are firefighters, and that's why it's so important that firefighters can see those tanks, get them shut down, or put water on them so they don't levy, or as what we say, explode.
That was a great question, Denise. Thanks. Gary, we literally have 1 minute left, and I just want to make sure that I express to you our thanks for you taking your time out of your busy schedule and participating today. You always provide so much great information, and truly our thanks to you for sharing that with us today, and to all of our participants. And again, make sure you participate in the upcoming workshop dates. And thanks again, Gary.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks to everybody listening.